Do you ever have questions about your local government but have no idea who to ask? Honestly, sometimes we're not even sure, and we do this kind of thing for a living. But you shouldn't let that stop you from reaching out. Just call 311 or email 311@portlandoregon.gov, and they can resolve issues or help connect you with someone who can. 311 is available from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. 7 days a week, except federal holidays, but they'll get you information about your parks and rec classes, parking permits. You can even call to request ADA access or report issues in your neighborhood like campsites, graffiti, stolen bikes. Let me just put it this way. If you're wondering who to call and it's not an emergency, use 311 as your first stop. Summer, unfortunately, now means wildfire season in Oregon, and there's been a number of devastating fires in recent years that have burned hiking and camping spots very dear to many Portlanders. But how are those areas doing today, and when will they be safe to visit? So today on CityCast Portland, we're talking with Zach Ernest, outdoors editor and host of the Explore Oregon podcast at the Statesman Journal. He'll give us an update on the restoration efforts in some of our favorite natural areas, as well as talk through what this year's wildfire season is looking like. It's Wednesday, July 17th. I'm Claudia Meza, and this is what Portland's talking about. Well, Zach, we've seen a number of devastating wildfires in the last several years. Big picture, like what goes into restoring an area after it burns? Like how is it decided when it's safe to let people back in?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and one that we've seen play out a number of times, especially since about 2017, which is kind of where I mark the beginning of sort of the large wildfire era, or at least the large modern wildfire area, especially in Western Oregon. So after one of those big and, severely burning fires comes through, there's usually a closure that lasts anywhere from a year to multiple years, where the area is closed to the public. And the restoration that goes on during the closure kind of depends on what type of land it is. In some areas, there is salvage logging that'll happen where burned trees are cut and turned into timber before they deteriorate. The next big thing, and it's kind of similar, is removing hazard trees along roads, at recreation sites, at campgrounds. Hazard trees are just trees that have burned and are dead and are eventually going to fall down. And then there's work like replacing bridges, brushing out hiking trails that become overgrown, and just generally trying to get an area safe so that it can reopen to the public, because they're reopening it in a new environment. And so there's just new things that they have to consider.
Yeah, we have an outdoor expert that comes on, and she pointed out that areas that are being restored or have recently just opened might not be that safe because of, and I have never thought about this, landslides. Do you know what I'm talking about? Is that something that you see with these restorations, that occasionally the earth around it isn't too stable?
Oh, yeah. No, 100%. That's definitely something that is considered. I guess I would say that public agencies are really risk averse, and that's what leads to these really long closures. I mean, I think we're going to talk about it later, but the Opal Creek area has been closed since 2020. It's probably not going to open, for another few years. So we're talking about like 4, 5, 6 year closures. They're really careful about the safety of areas. So I would say that once they reopen it, you can feel pretty safe going back there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Opal Creek area. Since you brought it up, it was damaged during the 2020 Beachy Creek wildfire. For those who for some reason, just moved into town or never made it out there, what was it like before the fire? Like, how would you explain it to someone?
Oh, man. Yeah. Before the 2020 Beachy Creek fire, Opal Creek was considered probably the most impressive, totally intact old growth forest left in Oregon. I mean, it was home to 600 to 1,000-year-old gigantic, trees. It was just one of the few places in the Western Cascades where you had large areas that had never been logged. And when you combine that with the beautiful creeks and waterfalls, there's these turquoise swimming holes. It was just really, really, really beautiful. And it was a one-of-a-kind place. And then there was a long history, where activists worked to protect this area from logging in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So there's a long history with it. And when you bring that history and the beauty together, this was a place that Oregonians were just in love with. Like when people talked about their favorite places in Oregon, Opal Creek was very frequently high at the top of that list.
Yeah, I just remember how blue that water was. It was crazy. Well, you did a big story earlier this summer about the efforts to restore the Opal Creek area. Like, what are you seeing there today in your reporting? What were the creeks looking like? I'm just curious. Like,
The creeks look good. I mean, the water looks good. The thing that jumps out at you immediately is the severity of the fire. There was just a tragic combination of events that came together that led to the forest burning at just an extremely high severity. So we're talking about those monster trees, that dense rainforest just being incinerated in about 24 to 48 hours. And I mean, as a reporter, I got to visit it, and it's a weird experience because you recognize everything. The waterfalls are still there, the swimming holes are still there, and they still feel good. But the forest is so different that it's a strange feeling.
Are most of the trees just completely gone?
Yeah. In fact, the district ranger who I went up with, who is in charge of this big restoration effort, she compared it to Mount St. Helens after the eruption.
Oh, wow.
Other people like my friend who lives out there who kind of grew up in that area, he called it kind of the upside down in the show Stranger Things.
Yeah.
It's similar, but everything is just totally different because all the trees are basically dead. There was a big fire in there. Historic winds came through and it just cooked this area at about as high a temperature as we've seen in Oregon. So it's dramatic.
Yeah. And you're saying a few more years? Like, when do you think it will be open back to the public?
So the timeline that they've given me is 2 to 3 years. So they're doing a lot of work back there right now. It's taken them a while to get to this work because the fires were so big that they prioritized sites that were a little bit closer to being able to reopen. And so they've been reopening sites in that same area. Opal Creek was kind of the next one because there was so much work that needed to be done. And, entire bridges had to be replaced. So they're doing that this summer. The trails have started to disappear. So they're starting to brush those out, cut them out, reroute them. That hazard tree removal that I talked about is happening in the next few years. So their goal, once they decide to reopen it, they want places for people to go. They want to have some campgrounds open. They want to have some trails for people to hike. And so that's what they're working on. But yeah, it's like 2 to 3 years at this point.
Wow. All right, well, let's take a quick break here. And when we come back, the restoration of one of our city's most beloved natural areas. Making the right senior living choice is more than just a simple move for your parents. These are long-term care plans. You need solid information and the right person to walk you through each step of the decision-making process. And Lynn Smarges is that person. She's a trusted senior advisor and placement specialist that works tirelessly to ensure your loved ones find the best care tailored to their specific needs and preferences. From independent living and assisted living to memory care, Lynn guides you every step of the way, offering advice, valuable resources, and unwavering support. She researches the retirement communities which best fits your senior family members' circumstances. Not only that, she sets up the appointments to tour these communities and walks her families through each tour, advocating for them. You can rely on Lynn to offer your family the care and compassion you need during your senior living journey, because sometimes you just need that extra hand. Call in from Pacific Northwest Senior Care today at 503-830-1812 for your complimentary consultation and discover the difference a dedicated senior advocate can make. Yeah, another huge wildfire in recent years that really affected Portlanders was the 2017 Eagle Creek fire in the Columbia Gorge. That's the one that was started by like a teenager just messing around with firecrackers. So what's the area looking like today? Because, I mean, that's where the Punch Bowl Falls are. And I went in the winter. So it was just kind of insane. Like, could you explain to someone who hasn't been out there yet, like the difference of what it looks like now compared to before? Because I never actually saw it before.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. Eagle Creek is a great place to go and look and see how a fire transforms a forest. It didn't burn at quite the same severity as the Labor Day fires, but it burned at a pretty high severity. And so what you see previous, it had the green tunnel. And At this point, it's more open, but there's still a lot of trees out there. You'll see a lot of them are fire scarred, so are black. It's a little bit more open than it
Hmm.
was previously. But with that comes there's a kind of a green understory, the blackened snags and trees and stuff like that. But there's more life going on. There's lots of regrowth. There's wildflowers, and you have better views of some of the waterfalls actually because it's opened up a little bit.
Yeah, I gotta say, when I went, I mean, of course, I saw the scarring, but it didn't feel as immense as I
Hmm.
remember the pictures of the fires being. I thought
Hmm.
I would go and it would just be like scorched earth, and it wasn't. And you're right, they're better views of the waterfall, which is kind of sad to say. But like, let's talk about these places that have been open. They're absolutely safe. But what should people know before they head out to explore a burned area? Because like I brought up the fact that there might be landslides still. I know that when they open them, they're doing so knowing that that's not going to really happen, but occasionally it just does.
Hmm.
Um, like, why does that happen? Like, why landslides?
Well, landslides are because the fire burns away all the vegetation, it kills some
Hmm.
of the trees, and so it's just all the soil, the stuff that's holding it into place is gone, and so it's really susceptible to heavy rains coming in and just washing everything away. Actually, after the Eagle Creek fire, that was a major problem because the gorge is so steep. That
Hmm.
those trees were doing really important work in holding everything together. And once you got rid of that, there was a ton of landslides. I think one of the places in the Columbia Gorge that hasn't reopened is Oneonta Gorge, which was just a beloved slot canyon where people could walk up this creek. And it was like, it was some Lord of the Rings stuff. I mean, it's a very narrow, moss covered canyon. It was really popular, really beloved. But it was so steep that after the fire burned everything off, like trees, rocks, debris just filled in that
Whoa.
slot canyon. And so they haven't reopened it because that is too dangerous.
Yeah. So, like, what are some good tips, that people should know before they head out to explore a burned area, being that there's still these hazards?
Honestly, like the biggest thing to be aware of is the lack of shade.
Yeah.
Especially in the summer. And I'm somebody
Hmm.
that backpacks a lot in wildfire scars. Like I enjoy exploring wildfire scars, but boy, you got to be prepared to.
Hmm.
Maybe you can bring a sunshade or just hike in the morning because it gets so hot, especially in newly burned areas. There's just not much protection. So that's honestly one of the biggest things that I think about going out there. Also, going cross country. If you're somebody that likes to get off the trail, explore cross country, which is definitely allowed in wilderness areas and national forests, it can be a lot harder in
Hmm.
wildfire burned areas just because there's a ton of downed trees and bramble and stuff that's grown up. So that can be a little trickier. But beyond that, I think shade is the biggest thing because, again, like if they open an area, they open a trail, I'm going to feel pretty safe about going out there.
Hmm. Well, I'm curious what these areas are going to look like 21 years from now. And we actually do have an example of that. The B&B complex fires, which was a linked pair of wildfires that together burned over 90,000 acres. It was absolutely catastrophic. That was back in 2003. And at the time, President George W. Bush called it a holocaust. Like, that's how awful these fires were. Like, what does it look like now, 21 years later?
Yeah, the B&B complex is such a fascinating moment in Oregon's history because it was actually, along with the B&B complex, there was the Biscuit Fire in
Mm,
Southern Oregon in 2002. And the two of those were massive fires. And they were fires that people in Oregon really hadn't seen. They
mhm.
were kind of this new era of big and hot wildfires that have kind of come with the warming climate and overstocked forests. They were like a canary in a coal mine fire 2 decades before they become more common. And I think that the scar of both is instructive, although it's not perfect. So just like the 2020 Labor Day fires, the B&B complex was a hot burning fire. It killed most of the trees to the point that now, 21 years later, the scar of the B&B complex still doesn't have that tree canopy. You can tell, like, when you walk from unburned area into burned area from the B&B complex because all of a sudden there's not much shade. What's always amazes me or amuses me in some ways is how there's a little miniature forest coming up. Though it burns so hot that it took trees a while to germinate and start growing, but they have. And now a lot of that forest is coming up. It's maybe like shoulder level or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
you'll have tons of lodgepole pines that are, about the size of my 7-year-old daughter.
Yeah, it's a good place to go and pretend you're a giant, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, definitely. That's kind of what you feel. You feel like in a land of like Lilliputians or
Yeah.
something like that. It is amusing because you have entire stretches of forest that are just short. And then there's some tall guys that, pop out now and then. But it's sobering a little bit because, that's what the Opal Creek area is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. That's not true for every fire. There are plenty of fires that don't burn nearly as hot, that are good fires. They clear out the brush. They're really healthy. And you can barely tell that they happen. There's a ton of wildfire scars like that. But for the big ones, the ones that like capture headlines, it just takes a while.
Yeah. Well, now that we're in the middle of yet another fire season, like how's the outlook across the state? After this recent heat wave, I know you mentioned before we started taping that there are a few fires going now. You want to fill us in?
Yeah, it's, we came into this fire season really optimistic, especially on the west side of the state. We were drought free in June for the first time since 2017. There were signs we'd get more moisture than normal this summer. So forecasters were feeling pretty optimistic. I went to a briefing where wildfire forecasters updated senators and just told them what they were expecting. And then this heat wave came, and not only was it really hot, but it was what meteorologists call a flash drought. So it basically sucked all the moisture out of the forest, out of the fuels really rapidly. And it reversed all those good trends, and it's quickly dried out the fuels to the point that all bets are kind of off on the season we're going to have.
Oh, man.
I mean, it's already been bad in eastern and central Oregon, especially. There's grass fires that have already burned over 100,000 acres in the rangeland. There were fires in Redmond and Lapine that came dangerously close to burning significant homes and causing impact. And now there's thunderstorms and lightning in the forecast this week. So there's the potential for this to be a pretty rough fire season, but that also doesn't mean it'll happen. The last few summers, honestly, we've come in and it's been dry. It depends on how those ingredients come together. Like if we get a lot of lightning strikes without rain, if we get human-started fires, if we get east winds, it could be really bad. Or, if the thunderstorms deliver some rain, it moderates a little bit. It could be a quiet season, but at this point, it's kind of up in the air.
Yeah. You live in this. This is your beat. I know that you might feel like a sense of elevated risk than most people because we're not thinking about it every day. Do you have like a doomsday package already ready to go? Like, because you live out there. Like, do you have like a gas mask? Do you have air purifiers? Like, I'm curious what your setup is.
Well, I live on a creek, so that's helpful. I can just go pop into the creek and feel pretty good about things. But yeah, no, I mean, I have air purifiers. I am prepared to evacuate. I did evacuate during the 2020 fires. I watch the weather really closely. There's a little park close to me. I put up my own signs there telling people not to have campfires.
You put your own signs?
Yeah, I print it. And my daughters even, like, they'll draw their own little signs. Like, they'll draw it's like an art project. They're out of school right now. And so they'll draw a picture of like a fire and like a big X through it because we're worried, like, people come and hang out there. If they have a campfire, it gets away. Like that's on us fast. And when it's this dry, and it's this dry every summer, I've gotten a little numb to it just because every summer has been like that potential is there. So I was rafting the Willamette River this past week, and we camped in an area where you could have a campfire. And there weren't the restrictions, but the grass was so dry. Like, you could just tell looking at it, like, almost just thinking about flames, it felt like was going to ignite the entire forest because it was so dry.
Just thinking hot thoughts. I guess.
Yep, yeah. And it happens in such, ways that people don't expect. Just like parking on dry grass, that can start a fire. And like, especially in the Willamette Valley, people aren't used to that. Historically, this just wasn't a thing. And so you've seen all these human ignited fires that have a much bigger impact now, especially in Salem. We've had evacuations 3 years in South Salem, like in an urban area, just because the grass is so dry and people are starting these fires. So, boy, I would encourage people to be so aware of the many ways you can start fires and to not do it, because once it sparks, like when it's this dry, it can just run.
Yeah, and everyone's going to hate you.
Yes, they will. You can plead ignorance to a point, but yeah, you don't want to be the person that starts the fire that burns like the beloved swimming hole. I mean, that's like, oh man.
Yeah. Seriously. Well, Zach, thank you so much for your reporting and for hanging out with me today. It's like a hard subject to go through just because, I mean, I was here, for those like post-apocalyptic like month. It felt like it was like a whole month of just not being able to breathe in Portland. Was it like 2020?
Yeah, that was 2020. I mean, those fires were unusual. But it shows you the possibilities. Like if the right circumstances line up, like that's the worst case scenario.
Or the wrong circumstances line up.
Yeah. The wrong circumstances. I would say most fire seasons aren't like that. There's big fires, small fires, and it's a mix of them. But yeah, like I said, all bets are off at this point.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed, Zach.
Fingers crossed, exactly.
Well, that's all for today here on CityCast Portland. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Until then, see you at Slim's.